Welcome back to the Awakening Conversations podcast. My name is Kate and I'm here with my co-host Amanda. If you joined us for our episode with Donna Zerner, you'll remember the powerful conversation we had about her experience with Aubrey Marcus's teacher, Marc Gafni. In that episode, we explored Donna's story and began to see with more clarity what so many felt but couldn't quite name, that something about Marc, his teachings, and the energy behind them felt deeply off. Since then, we've gone even deeper. We've uncovered more about the actual figure behind Marc's work. A man Gafni himself has publicly claimed to be the reincarnation of a man named Sabbatai Zevi, and the dark, inverted influence that shapes his teachings, and the disturbing lineage of distortion and boundary breaking hidden beneath the language of liberation and enlightenment. We've also discovered the Sabbatean and Frankist movements that have been birthed from Sabbatai Zevi's ideology, and how their emergence mirrors Gafni's own pattern of reinvention. And to be clear, this is not a conversation about religion or religious beliefs. What we're exploring here is a darker agenda that has moved through many religious movements and far beyond them, into the very fabric of our society. Much of this is being exposed right now through this great collective awakening. This is a two-part video, and in part one today, we're pulling back the curtain on that energy, and we'll begin uncovering the roots of Marc Gafni's work and the shadowy influence behind them, and why it leaves so many people feeling uneasy, even when the words sound spiritual and freeing on the surface. And then in part two, we'll connect what we uncover today to the much bigger picture. We'll expand more on Gafni's connection to these darker energies and really show you how they are showing up in the modern movements, our spiritual communities, and even in global agendas. So let's begin part one by exploring the roots of Marc Gafni's teachings, the influence of Sabbatai Zevi, and the darkness at the heart of it all. Amanda, this has been quite a journey for us, as we have had the great opportunity to be able to speak with Donna Zerner in our last episode when we were talking about this topic. And at that time, this was something that really many pieces fell into place for you, particularly, that has expanded, your understanding of these darker energies that are at play that we've started to really dive into understanding more of. And I'd love for you to start this conversation today about how we really got ourselves here to be having this conversation today, talking more about Marc Gafni and these energies at play.
Yeah. You and I, we had the opportunity to speak with Donna prior to recording the episode where we shared about him. And it was a really powerful conversation that had me thinking a lot about what she had to share with us and kind of making sense of all of the information. And I think it was either the next day or maybe 2 days later, I was walking the dog, and that's when I get a lot of insights. And this connection in my brain happened where I think the day prior, Candace Owens had mentioned Sabbatai Zevi and the Frankists again. She had done some pieces about them in previous episodes, but I think it had been a while. But she did an episode, and so that was fresh in my mind. And something that really stood out to me in her stories and what she has spoken to about them is how the Frankists, she speaks about more, I'd say, is that they insert themselves into different religions. They were in the Jewish faith, and then they had to leave, and then they went to Islam, and then Christianity. And so the dots that were connected in my brain were how that was the same pattern that it sounded like Marc Gafni was experiencing or doing as well. Like the story of that we speak to in the other episode is that he was in a community within Israel. He got kicked out of there. Then he went into another community. Multiple communities, it blew up, but he'd go away, and then he'd come up somewhere else. And that was what we were seeing with him. It's like he found another place where he could pop up with Aubrey Marcus. And so I'm like, wow, that's very similar energy as far as manipulation and gaslighting and controlling and using inverted and distorted ways of breaking tradition and boundary breaking. So I, went on to ChatGPT and I just started having conversation. I'm experiencing these connections between Gafni and Frankists and Sabbatean, let's compare and contrast some of the qualities. And it was a really cool conversation. It was like, well, yeah, there's these considerable similarities. Like, what are the odds of that? And I asked him, like, well, how do we find out who's actually like the lineages of like the Sabbateans or the Frankists? And it was like, well, there's not any official lineages of them. There are people that follow, but they're underground, they're hidden. And so that was interesting. So then I messaged you and Donna and shared this conversation, and Donna was very helpful. And she's like, well, that's very interesting, because here are these episodes of him actually talking about Sabbatai Zevi. For those listening, it might be said different ways. Sabbatai Zevi, Shabtai Zevi. And so she linked us to some conversations where he's speaking about, and we're going to dive into more of those today. She connected me to connections between him and Jeffrey Epstein, and then other people having connected him to them. But we have actual evidence out of Gafni's mouth that he actually is a follower of his work, and even more than that, which we'll dive into as we get into this. And so to me, I'm like, wow, this is pretty fascinating that we landed here just by looking at the patterns and seeing this connection. And it's not even us speculating anymore, because we have it coming out of his mouth. And so, yeah, and we didn't really speak to this in the episode with Donna, because that wasn't the focus, right? The focus was on her story. And that's a can of worms that we weren't ready to get into in that episode. And so, yeah, we've had some opportunity now to listen to some more of his words, right? And we want to unpack his words and let those of you listening like understand who Sabbatai Zevi and the Frankists were, so then you can start to see these energies, kind of like how we just did. These energies are present in multiple facets of our world, but most people don't even know those words or who Sabbatai Zevi was. And so that's what we want to really illuminate here for you, and maybe you'll start making some connections as well.
And I want to say, before we dive into the first clip we want to show, is that as we have done this exploration, the most fascinating part, as you said there, is that there's, beyond Gafni himself being a follower, and as we said, we'll go deeper into that, this energy and influence is in many different places in our society and our world. And the thing that we've, really been talking about lately is what we're seeing, the darkness we're seeing. And really the goal with today too is helping you understand it from a new framework too, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's what I keep having this experience of. And it is helping me to make sense of the forces that are at play. But while it might seem like a scary thing to look at the dark and open our mind to the potential that this exists, it's been a really empowering experience for me at the same time. So I just wanted to frame that with, if it feels uncomfortable, it is uncomfortable stuff at times, but if you can allow yourself to sit with it, you do come into a place of power. And maybe we can chat about that down the end when we talk about some other things. But for now, let's dive into a clip here of Marc Gafni talking about an experience he had with a shaman and how he came to really be connected with the work of how he pronounces it is Sabbatai Zevi. We'll let Marc explain that for you first and foremost.
And this Inca shaman says to me, I've had a dream that some master has fallen, and now I realize it was you. And I need to, and he was very expensive to work with. He said, I don't need anything from you. I just want you to work with me. And I want you to come to Prague with me. This is true. This is all true, Andrew. Right? I want you to come to Prague with me, and we're going to battle the mystical forces in Prague, because there are mystical forces in Prague that need battling, and we need to engage in some shamanic way this battle. And I'm not going to tell the story, but I went to Prague to engage this mystical battle, right? It's a story. And then we went to Poland, right? To kind of try and free souls that were kind of stuck in the ground. And I thought, it's 2007. I thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'm never going to go back and teach publicly again. I was in too much pain, but I'm going to spend my life as a kind of wandering Hasidic shaman freeing souls,
And just for context, everyone, that was after like the first big explosion of scandal with his Jewish community in Israel, where he had to flee Israel. Just some context.
From graveyards. I thought that seemed like a good way to spend a lifetime, right? And then he says to me, I just listened to this. He says, and we start talking, and this conversation develops. He says, and you're the reincarnation of Sabbatai Zevi. And I'm like, really? What the fuck? Why is an Inca shaman in fucking Prague and Poland telling me, right, that I'm the reincarnation of Sabbatai Zevi? And it's like, so this conversation continues. Then he goes to Sabbatai Zevi's grave, right, to bring me back an energetic blessing. And the story goes on and on, right? I'll hold the story now, but I'll just give you just one more thing, just to establish this is a little thing that I don't really share with people. But if you open up A Return to Eros, right? This is the book I wrote with Christina Kincaid, right? So it opens and it says, I come to speak dangerous words. I ask only that you listen dangerously, Chung Sa. And then, of course, there's Bob Dylan, but to live outside the law, you've got to be honest, right? But then, on the next page, right, the key page is, and I'll just show it here, if you can see it.
Yeah.
It says to Sabbatai and Sarah. So the book is dedicated to Sabbatai and to Sarah.
So let's talk about what we're hearing there. This is how he came to connect, I think, with Sabbatai Zevi for the first time, and being told by an Incan shaman that he is the reincarnation of him. And so he has dedicated one of his books to him. So that like establishes this connection.
Yeah, and so let's talk a little bit about Sabbatai Zevi, just to paint a picture of who the hell is this person that we're talking about. So it was the 1600s, around the 1660s. It was the time of the Ottoman Empire, and at that time, the Jewish communities were in crisis. I don't know the history, but apparently this was a challenging time, and they were yearning for a Messiah. Along comes Sabbatai Zevi. He is said to be a very charismatic mystic who was then declared to be the next Messiah. They speak about in this video that, there was a lot of rallying around him to be the one to kind of change things. So there was quite a lot of favor for him. At some point, he is put in front of, I believe it's the Sultan of Turkey. He's given the choice of death because of some discretions or to convert. And under that pressure, he decides to convert to Islam. And this leaves his followers pretty shattered, but some of them interpret this as something divine. So this is where the Sabbateans are following emerge, and this becomes a secretive sect who outwardly follow Islam, but secretly practice the inverted Jewish rituals that Sabbatai got himself in trouble for. The core ideology here is transgression as redemption, breaking laws and taboos as mystical acts. Do you want to share a bit more of how the Sabbateans then evolved into what we mentioned before as the Frankists?
Yeah, well, so the Frankists came about a century later, and Jacob Frank continued Sabbatai Zevi's work, and he took it even further. So we'll share some of these transgressions later in the video, but the Frankists really took it a lot further with sexual rituals, communal taboos, doing things to shock society. So this concept of antinomianism, which is seen as law-breaking as being something that's sacred. So Sabbatai's followers, they converted to Islam, and then the Frankists inserted themselves into Christianity. So there's that pattern of, getting caught because you're breaking all the rules, and then you have to leave and you have to go insert yourself somewhere else. And throughout this, this has been very secretive, keeping these practices hidden. And the pattern with the Frankists were about underground survival and reinventing themselves. So I haven't heard of, I imagine Gafni has spoken about the Frankists somewhere because he's very prolific, and we've only touched a very small sample of Gafni's work. I haven't listened to or heard anything about him speaking about the Frankists per se. Donna did mention there is an author who wrote a book about Jacob Frank celebrating him. And he mentioned he's problematic in ways, but he was also celebrating him. And he compared Gafni to Jacob Frank. I did not find where he said that, but that's what Donna shared with us. So that's kind of the lineage. And when I first heard Candace Owens speak about the Frankists, she got a lot of backlash for speaking about the Frankists and some of the acts that are publicly available for people to read about. She was called anti-Semitic for even speaking about the Frankists. So it seems with her, when there's a strong reaction to something she shares about, that's for her, that's the indication that that's a topic that she needs to look at deeper, right? And so the fact that, these people have been, and Gafni speaks to it as well, is that the followers of Zevi were the thought leaders of the day, right? So it wasn't just the masses. And so these people were, and what I thought of were like, quote unquote, the elite, right? Is that those were the ones following them. And so the fact that these were such big, prominent, figures, and yet most people have not even heard of Sabbatai Zevi, right? To me, that's support that this is something that's being kept secretive for, yet it's coming up and inserting itself. We're seeing Gafni, let me insert myself here. Let me sprinkle my viewpoint, my philosophy in. Let me reach your followers, Aubrey Marcus. And so it's continuing the lineage without outwardly saying, right? He shared about this, but it's not, we're not seeing, that's not what this is being branded as, right? His work is not being branded as Sabbatean in its roots.
Yeah. So then let's go a little bit deeper, and Mark is going to talk a bit more about Sabbatai Zevi and what exactly it is that he has done and how he used his teachings. I will say that I'm not sure we have a clip of it, but he had a strong belief, and it is part of a longer video which is linked below. Sabbatai Zevi, he mentions that he has this belief that is very much outside of his upbringing religiously, is that we don't need the intermediary of the church to have a direct connection to God. We are divine beings of God. And so therefore that's his framework, is we can have that connection. But how he goes about us being able to find and feel that connection, especially when it comes to women and the feminine, is what we're going to start to really unpack here. And this is really to start to show you some of the connection, again, from what we all felt and sensed within the Aubrey Marcus episode, and just to give some background on where some of this is coming from. So we'll let Mark explain some more.
What I just said, that's the public story. But here's actually what happened. And this is what Shalom begins to realize. Shalom begins to realize, and he's studying him in the 20s and the 30s, right, in Israel, in Jerusalem, before Israel's even declared a state. Shalom begins to look at the text. And of course, people realized it before Shalom, but Shalom was the first person who did this magisterial, entry into the manuscripts and the text. And Shalom realizes it's not that the masses were just following him, but actually the most profound minds, right, of the day, the most sophisticated, right, unimaginable, towering, right, personas of enlightenment and intellect and what I would call eros, right, the great masters of their day, who would make any of the geniuses of today, right, appear like kindergartners, right? He swept them. In other words, he wasn't just sweeping the masses. He actually swept this enormous array of some of the greatest giant intellect, mind, hearts, greatest, Rishi Seer, masters that ever lived are actually taken by him, and actually, as you say, are utterly convinced that he is the Messiah, son of David. So in other words, something was happening here. And he had a prophet, they called him the prophet, which was Nathan of Azza, Nathan Ha'azati, Nathan from Aza, was an unimaginably subtle, sophisticated, gorgeous thinker. And this great and wild, right, sweep that Sabbatai is doing amongst the greatest masters of the age are with their knowledge of his breaking of sexual boundaries. So we have to understand he's operating within the classical Orthodox community, because there is no other community, right, in which the law is everything. And he is sweeping major Kabbalistic masters, Jonathan Eibschitz, for example, one of the most unimaginable masters of his day, completely swept up by Sabbatai Zevi, but the list is long. So what's happening here? And now just go with me just one more step. So Shalom is fascinated by Sabbatai Zevi, and then Shalom basically takes all of Jewish Kabbalistic scholarship, this huge enterprise, which is central to the cultural enterprise of the state of Israel. You know, the leading Kabbalah scholar in America is, I won't say his name because we're going to hold mystery and privacy there, but he's a close friend who was just in my house for several days, right? One of the people, I think, Kathy, who's here on the broadcast, was up there with me and James, and we were talking about this. And he, of course, you know, he doesn't associate with me publicly, but he comes to visit me and study. Right? So that's a different conversation, right? And bless him, and he's a good man, right? But literally the entire enterprise of Kabbalah scholarship in the last 60, 70 years, post Shalom's book, is obsessed with Sabbatai Zevi. In other words, there's more scholarship, right? And fascination. The word fascination is a great word, right? Fascination is a form of love. It means I'm compelled, I'm allured, right? I'm engaged with Sabbatai Zevi. So Sabbatai Zevi becomes this radically central character at the heart of what I would say is the cultural enterprise of Kabbalah scholarship, even as he sweeps the major masters, and yet he's demonized kind of in the standard narrative. That's just kind of who we're talking about. I just want to get a sense of who we're talking about.
Yeah. So when I listened to that the first time, I found it interesting that there's someone that is high in the Jewish Kabbalah world that won't publicly associate with Marc Gafni. And what I took from it is like, he's doing this work, he's inserting himself, he's spreading his message, and he's doing this work, and he's connected to powerful, influential people, and yet has to do it separate, because if he gets caught or he gets found out, there is not that direct connection there that can tie him back to this other person. And so it's this almost like a secrecy mechanism to stay hidden and covert, which is part of these movements and ideologies, because they have throughout history been, we got kicked out there, we need to go. And so if they kind of keep themselves compartmentalized, when one faction of the spread of this ideology gets found out, everyone doesn't get found out, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think what we really want to start to paint the picture of, or like bring the dots together in our modern society, is the first thing that comes to my mind is a similar pattern with, let's say, Epstein. So we have these powerful people, allegedly, in these compromised positions doing, let's say, sexual boundary breaking acts. I don't necessarily know whether it's redemption through sin or just this, there's pushing of boundaries for sure in the realm of sex that are somehow protected. And, there's the one person there who has been discovered, but we're protecting the names of the powerful people who were actually deep supporters of this. So there's this mirroring of what I really saw in that description by Gafni, was how this darker energy works with inside power structures that then, exactly as you said, is hidden.
Like Epstein in a way is the fall guy, and he's not going to bring down the whole system, right?
Yeah.
Web exists, but we're not connecting the web publicly. The connections are secret.
So let's explore this Sabbatai character a little deeper and really understand his philosophy. So what was it that what was his work? What was his ideology? What was it that he was doing within these traditions? and the beliefs that he was bringing to the people and the powers that he was associated with.
About, what did he actually stand for? Like, who was he? So the first thing he stands for, we're talking about this liberation of the feminine. So in Lurianic Kabbalah, which is so crazy gorgeous, right? And so subtle and so hard to read, right? Anyone who's read integral theory is like the easiest thing to read compared to Lurianic Kabbalah. It's a very subtle, complex, and so in Lurianic Kabbalah, there's a hidden, well, not hidden if you're not reading carefully. Once you read carefully, it's very clear, called Aliyata Nukva, the ascension of the feminine. And the ascension of the feminine is about fixing the degradation of the feminine, which Luria locates in the moment in which the sun and the moon in the original creation story are supposed to be equal lights. And then, so in the text, you see there's sun and moon. And then there's some moment in which the sun clearly becomes dominant and the moon becomes in devotion to the sun, but the moon loses its power. That appears in the Genesis text if you read it carefully. The sun is understood as the masculine, in mythic terms, the moon, the feminine. And this prioritizing at a certain moment in history of the masculine, although perhaps necessary, right, is viewed by Luria as something like what modern feminism calls patriarchy. It's viewed by Luria as an utter violation of the nature of reality. And so therefore, what needs to happen is the masculine and the feminine are actually, they need to turn away from each other. They need to individuate. And Luria describes 7 stages of Aliyata Nukva, of the ascension of the feminine. And in I have a volume called the Radical Kabbalah, in volume 2, which is about the wisdom of Solomon. If you look at the index, I go through the original Lurianic sources and the Zohar sources, the Aramaic sources about this notion, right? The emergence of the feminine. But for Luria, that's a theoretical, mystical, right, interior process. Sabbatai says no. Sabbatai says, let's make this real, right? The feminine needs to claim her fullness. Now, that's part 1, but here it gets crazy, and then turn back to, here's part 2. It gets completely crazy, Andrew. And part of the fullness of the feminine is the fullness of her fuck, the fullness of her eros, right? And Luria actually works very hard to actually say that Lilith, who is the she demon, because she's lost this radical sexuality. If you read Luria carefully, which I did with an old friend of mine, and we published a Hebrew book that we're now about to republish on 2,000 years of texts about Lilith, right? Luria reclaims Lilith into the precincts of the sacred and says that Lilith actually, this she demon Lilith, is actually the first Eve. The second Eve is the kind of, expression of the feminine through the eyes of patriarchy, but Lilith is the full power of the radicalized, erotic feminine, which the church also recognized, which is why, but the church demonized, right, feminine desire. The church says feminine desire is insatiable and wild and way beyond any kind of dimension of masculine desire. And my old colleague David Data, right? David writes about this a lot, right? The kind of the radical, gorgeous nature of feminine desire that far exceeds masculine desire. The church demonizes it. Luria reclaims the feminine and says, no, Lilith, radical feminine desire, needs to be in the precincts of the sacred. And then Sabbatai turns to the feminine and to the masculine, but to the feminine to lead, and says to the feminine, right, live the fullness of your desire and reclaim its utter purity.
Mm-hmm.
Whoa, we're like, whoa, we're there in the 17th century. And he does this, Andrew, through radical acts of boundary breaking, which I won't go into now, but they're radical boundary breaking acts. But that's his second move.
So for me, like, the pattern that we're seeing is like he's saying things that I think people want to hear, right? That the women has the ability to claim their desire, that women have like this liberation through being who we truly are versus these repressed, controlled beings, which the church promoted and tried to contain, right? However, I think what is confusing, how this inserts itself is that it's like taking things that resonate and also inserting these darker boundary breaking acts in that process, right? And we're going to listen next to some of that, right?
Yeah, just go straight to that.
Okay.
Say clear. I'm going to be really clear here, right? Right. In other words, Sabbatai was a broken figure. He was filled with brokenness, right? And we're all filled with the holy and broken, hallelujah. But Sabbatai was not a figure to be imitated. Sabbatai was not a clean, pure teacher, right? And now every clean, pure teacher has faults and flaws. We're all imperfect vessels for the light. But Sabbatai was more than that. Sabbatai was actually wildly expansive and then wildly broken. He would both close and then open. Right? Actually, when he goes to the Sultan, right, the meeting doesn't go well because actually he's in a madly depressed state when he goes, and he's not in an open state. One of the reasons the meeting doesn't go well. So Sabbatai is not a figure to be emulated, and Sabbatai is basically having women sleep with their brothers, right? He's having women sleep with their sons, right? In other words, he's breaking every boundary, right, in the most radical way. So clearly, right, neither I or Bonnie, right, are on board with that kind of radical boundary breaking. What we are on board with is, I think, and I can't speak for Bonnie, but we are on board with the reclaiming of what we might call the purity of fuck, the goodness of Eros, right? The realization that the tumescence of the feminine and the throbbing of the masculine, right, is actually an expression of the cosmoerotic universe in person, awake and alive in me, which is utter purity, right? The purity of that, the goodness of that. So Sabbatai, in this radical anarchic way, breaks every vessel, right, without any containment in order to point towards that truth. And vessels shatter and enormous suffering is caused, and yet it opens something up. So he's one of those figures, right, who was in some sense a messianic figure, and that he changed, but not a messianic figure in the sense that he was perfect or that he got everything right, that he actually changed the course of human spiritual history. So in other words, the temple, right, actually was an expression of this sense of the purity of the radical aliveness, not of sexing, but of the fuck of cosmos, of the eros of cosmos, which in one expression incarnates in our body. And what Sabbatai is saying is, although he goes too far because he's breaking all the vessels, but what he gets right at the core is I've got to be able to trust my body. And it's if I can't trust that the surging force of Eros in my body, when it's clarified, not its pseudo form, not in its sloppy form, but the clarified Eros in my body, if I can't trust the goodness of that, then I'm lost in shame. And that's because I'm trying to be this good social person. I'm trying to be this good obedient person, this good religious person. And I've got this surging force of Eros that moves, that demands, that allures me. That's this raging, pulsing desire. Like, so if I can't actually recognize that desire is the nature of cosmos, desire is the nature of she, and that desire lives uniquely as me, and that to be a unique self is to be a unique configuration of desire. And I can't actually live that desire in my body according to and in accordance with my own unique script of desire. Right? If I can't access my unique script of desire, my unique scripts of desire either hijacked or demonized and degraded by the churches, the old lineages, or the new pornographic lineages, which tell me what I should desire. If I can't access that desire, then I can't trust myself. That's what we're saying. So Sabbatai, he goes too far. He breaks all the vessels. Breaks all the vessels. And I want to be really clear about that, right? In other words, right? And he's pointing towards something. And so he's saying, women, arise. And part of arising is claim the purity of your tumescence, the goodness of your fuck, the Lilith that lives inside of you, and merge the raging quality of your desire with the fierce tenderness of your nurturing, right? Which is, who you are. The church demonized that. The old lineage has demonized that. No, that's authentic. That's true. That's holy. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what I really see in this particular clip, which I think is, helping us paint a picture of where we're going to go later in this conversation, is there is some truth in here, especially that last particular part of that conversation where, there is this offering for women to find a sense of liberation. We can imagine what it was like back in that time where the church did demonize our sexuality. It was used against us. We were whores. We were impure, all of that as a control mechanism, probably to keep the men in check as well, which I think it worked the opposite way anyway. But we can see how that would be a desire, a want, a gift of freedom, a gift of authenticity, right? To claim more of who I am as a woman. What I think is important to then consider when we take in the larger scope of Marc Gafni is this man, which we're going to give you a real clincher here in a second, who has dedicated his book to Sabbatai Zevi, who is a follower of these beliefs, has a past of a lot of allegations of sexual misconduct, which has been many reasons why he has had to leave the different communities he has been part of. And we, as we said at the start, have seen Sabbatai Zevi had the similar challenge of these sexual misconduct within communities where he was then asked to leave and then converts, and then the Sabbatean movement then continues this underground form of transgression. So what we're trying to really paint the picture of here is, first and foremost, Marc Gafni as an example of this energy, because when we come back to that particular podcast episode with Aubrey Marcus, we are seeing where, how do I even want to phrase this? Like, there was an intentional, I believe, in the larger picture of his relationship with Aubrey Marcus, like a pure intent, perhaps, of wanting to be the most liberated version of Aubrey's self and maybe even Vailana's self. But I believe that as we get a little deeper into that, there is this, what we will see, and we're going to really unpack this soon, the inversion of what that liberation is to something that is this boundary breaking, this breaking of vessels. And I think the thing that we saw as viewers of that Radical Monogamy episode was the breaking of the vessel of Vailana. I cannot go past that particular part where she is explaining the descent she had to go through to override her inner boundaries, her sense of what her monogamous relationship was, to crack it open to find this new form. And it is, to me, another way of this breaking of the vessels, although, he does say, but that was the wrong way. We witnessed a breaking open of a woman's vessel, be it her body, be it her boundaries, to accept this new way to find the deeper connection to God, deeper connection to her husband. So that's what comes up for me when I first watched that particular part of that clip.
Right. Yes. And the thing about with boundaries, right? It's not like we're going to go right to introducing into the, trying to normalize it. We're going to inch our way in. Let's turn polyamory into a form of monogamy, right? And so little by little, we're whittling away of the vessel, of the container. And then I think that maybe this path, someone described it, and something I listened to, is like, you're going down, in order to go up the mountain, you have to go down deep into the valley before you can go up. And to me, what came to me was the idea of rock bottom. Like, you have to, like, once, you hear the stories of redemption that people go through, once they hit rock bottom, and they have to go there in order to find themselves. And maybe that's what this is to some degree. I don't know. But I think if we had a world of like, let's hit our rock bottom, like that's the norm. Let's break everything that we know in order to find our true desires. I don't know. Is that truly liberation, or is that like creating chaos where we're just having a bunch of broken glass that we can't put back together. And yes, the Radical Monogamy episode, right? That was this insertion of this new distorted boundary breaking idea that many of us felt they were suddenly trying to let's insert this in here and let's promote this new way of being. And do we want to play that piece just so we can remind people of, what so many people reacted to very instinctually and viscerally in terms of it was a no from so many people. So let's watch that piece so we can be reminded of that energy.
I think, I want to get to this, the entry of Alana into our story. I'm super eager to get there. I think, one of the things that also prepared me is for, eventually, and we'll get to this part of the story, but there's a lot of men who pretend that they're in a place where they can bless their women to do the same things that they do. And then when it comes down to actually ante up the chips on the table, the hand gets a little shaky,
Right.
and the cards fold. And, Vi, although it hasn't been the richness and depth and love that I've shared with Alana, also had that moment where she had a lovership and she got to watch me, put my chips unflinchingly on the table, actually be her wingman, help her make this connection with someone she was interested, someone I play ball with who thought, this is a good man. And she got to watch me bless her in this path. And I think that's also important to recognize, is it's not these rules are good for me, but not for we, and so while it's not quid pro quo, there's the openness in the space that I think also
there's a profound equality.
There is equality.
Not quid pro quo, but there's a deep equality. There's
fundamental,
a deep mutuality
structural
and
quality.
respect.
Yeah.
Deep respect of full possibility and love within. And this is just the name we're calling it. And that'll be a perfect time to go to the next. We've given this a name. We're calling it radical monogamy in the field of erotic mystics. So paradoxically, this is not about polyamory. That's the paradox. It's actually about radical monogamy, meaning deep, exclusive, lifelong, committed relationship, right? But not in the classical monogamous sense. It's an expanded monogamy. But there's a radical monogamy, but it's just not a monogamy of two. It's a slightly bigger monogamy. But it's not, okay, we're not like moving in and out of partners. No, it's not the polyamory road. It's not the classical monogamy mode. It's a radical monogamy of deep exclusivity between Aubrey and Vi. And then there's going to be a new goddess who will step into the field, who will also step into this field of radical monogamy in the field of erotic mystics. So it's a very deep structure.
So that like clip of him speaking, him saying that really stood out to me. And like from this initial episode, it's like, we are calling this radical monogamy. And it's like, I'm proclaiming right now this new phrase to define this different way of doing polyamory. And what I think a lot of people reacted to from that video was that we were being sold something distorted, something untrue. Like, you're trying to repackage, trying to rebrand polyamory, and where you're using a label of something that's not polyamory, you're trying to use that label to make polyamory this arrangement with less boundaries. That's not to say that there are no boundaries in polyamory or anything like that. But it's like, let's blur the lines. Let's make monogamy and polyamory, let's make it a spectrum. Let's just like muddy the waters a little bit. And so maybe in theory, like, I can see polyamory in its highest expression in the most evolved places of humans. It could be a quite liberating arrangement. I can see that, actually. But for most, and if you're going to it from a place of, well, this this relationship is not working. Let's bring in a third person to try and fix what's not working, versus like, let's within the container, let's look at what's coming up for us in terms of let's be in a space with this person that we committed to and try to address what's there, rather than thinking an external person is going to solve an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's almost like giving a permission slip
Mm-hmm.
to, you're not actually doing polyamory, you're doing what's called radical monogamy. And
Mm-hmm.
I think, especially with Aubrey speaking, there's like this sense of arrogance that he has. It's like most men can't just give up their woman and let them unflinchingly allow them to go be with another man. And I don't know, it's kind of cringy watching that clip, because I mean, I feel like so much in this is like the rules don't apply to us, right? Like we can go down this path and it's going to be different for us than it is has been for other people. And maybe, I don't know, but I feel like the whole story is Aubrey being a little bit naive in terms of thinking like, oh, I can get out of this situation with Whitney. I can jump into marriage with Vailana. I can promise her monogamy and my desires aren't going to be there. And I can promise to get her there. And then I can convert her to polyamory once I have her, once she's committed, once like she's dependent upon me. So in a way, there's this arrogance that I feel both of them possess to believe that it works out differently for them. It's quite, and a lot of this with Gafni is quite ironic in that like some of what he's saying could be more believable if he didn't have the past that he has, right? The actions, like he is a very good, like he convinces people with his words, but does he have the track record to support what he is saying? And I think that's where there's the disconnect for me and with whatever he's saying, is because, okay, I'm following this guy, Sabbatai Zevi. I dedicate my book to him. I believe I'm the reincarnation of him. I'm here to, what we'll share in a little bit, continue his work. And yet, I'm just going to overlook the parts where he broke everything. And that's not what I'm following. Right?
Yeah.
Yet that's what he did in his journey. Like he left broken pieces.
Yeah.
Right? All these women were left broken as a result of his interactions with them. He did not liberate them, right? Like his interactions, the fuck that he gave them did not, maybe there's some women that did, but there's the ones that have spoken, have shared stories of pain and
humiliation,
trauma. So yeah, the words and the track record, do those line up?
Yeah. And, I think too, as you said, one of your points there, that the belief by Aubrey and Vailana that it's different for us. It's going to be different for us because it's not polyamory, it's radical monogamy. It's almost like they have to delude themselves of what it is to make it okay. Because if it's not called that, it's something else, and therefore it is different. And again, just watching Gafni and the languaging and the term of even bringing in a goddess, it's another woman, right? It's just it's a fancy way of saying another woman. And, it's again, like the word that got thrown around so often was the word salad. Like, what a wonderful phrase. But just this exactly like this constant reframing for the purposes of your, deepest alignment and deepest enlightenment and like that spiritual path where it's like this masking and cloaking of something you said you didn't want, but we can make it work by saying it's something that is a enlightened version of something you already have, but we're going to tweak it. But actually it's not. It's a completely different lane. It is not the same thing. And, that great disconnect. And so let's, if you're up for it, go straight to where he does speak about being here to continue Sabbatai's work And then we can really get into the nuts and bolts of what it is exactly.
Before we go there, I just want to mention what popped into my mind was when we had our first, I think it was our first initial conversation, and something, you know, without us knowing any of this, something that we sensed and we spoke to, I think briefly, was this idea of like, this is like a greater agenda of disrupting like family unit, the core relationships, and the confusing of it, creating confusion so that it's like this further thing that breaks the bonds that people are already struggling with. And then let's introduce this as an acceptable version of that because you're struggling. Oh, you know, they said something in there like, well, people are struggling in marriages. And so why don't we just, rather than let's say like, well, let's address why people are struggling in marriages, right?
Yeah.
In relationships, and rather than bringing this third confusing variable into the mix where it's like, maybe like, how many examples do we have of successful polyamorous containers?
Yeah.
And, you know, maybe they exist, but they're secretive, but also radical honesty was part of their, you know, so I guess they are being honest and sharing of it. But when things are kept in the dark and secret, is that quote unquote successful way to handle it? I mean, I think it's just, it creates a lot more confusion, and then that passes down that confusion into future generations in terms of how do you deal with relationship dynamics when they are not working out and you bring another person into the mix. So something I just wanted to add there. But yeah, let's move on and let's listen to where he speaks to what it is that he is here to do with regard to Sabbatai Zevi.
So what Sabbatai now, Sabbatai focuses on the sexual dimension. That's his way in, and not just Sabbatai. For most people, their way into the first fragrance of this field of Eros is through the sexual, which is why the sexual is so critical for people. And one of the things that we need to do is realize that the sexual models the erotic. It doesn't exhaust the erotic, right? That it's actually about fucking open reality in every dimension of life and not exiling the erotic into the sexual. And in some sense, I mean, I shouldn't say this. So I'm not going to say what I'm about to say, but in some sense, my interior self-experience is that something of Sabbatai's soul spark, right, entered me. And that's how we understand reincarnation. And that I'm trying to complete his work, right? And it's that actually he seeded the world with certain key ideas, but they were complete, and they were somewhat bipolar, so almost not all wrong. And we need to actually liberate those sparks and actually articulate this in a way where we can actually generate, right, a grounded culture of Eros. I didn't say.
So yeah, here to complete his work.
Yeah, so that sense of that patterning that I clued in on, that's there because he's here to finish his work.
And now the thing that I think is a stop point or a pause point is, okay, well, there's a breadth to this person's work, but the depth of it is, unfortunately, these inversion tactics, which was what we've just been discussing there with the Aubrey Marcus episode, which is really the clear example where we're seeing him in action with this Sabbatean influence into a structure that, you know, monogamy, as we said, and inverting it into something else. Some of what we are going to discuss now, or go on to discuss soon, is how this inversion is, as you said in the last little bit there, this breaking apart of the foundational structures of what make us feel whole, human, connected. And this is why this Sabbatean energy is showing up in our current society.
I don't know when and or if he will be on Aubrey's podcast again, because I think that it was like an exposure in a way, right?
Yeah.
People saw it. It feels like it hurt Aubrey's brand. He's done a lot of work with him. This most recent book was published under Aubrey's publishing company. He wrote the foreword. I'm just going to read a little clip from that. So it has been with great delight and a voracious appetite that I have consumed the teachings of Dr. Marc Gafni and colleagues. Gafni holds a distinguished position in my heart as my lineage master in the original wisdom of Solomon and later cosmo-erotic humanism lineage. I don't think Aubrey was in the dark as far as the philosophies and background, but we also have a connection between Gafni and Epstein. But we can just look to see like what is Gafni's response to his death, right? He is rationalizing, justifying, and creating an excuse for this dark energy that has broken so many people. How is that liberating the feminine? He is advocating for taking your desire to where it wants to take you.
Yeah.
And for those with unexamined dark energy, right, our desires are going to be to do things that harm other people. And is he looking at that? I don't think so, because he has not fully acknowledged publicly, at least to my knowledge, the error of his journey, of his following his arrows and his lust and his desires. And what did that result? Has he made amends for where his arrows led him?
There's the seed of hope in all of us that through the course of time, the truth will be revealed. But there's so many powers at play that are going to be trying so hard to hide the seed of truth that is inside that darkness that I don't know if we'll ever see it, but we have to trust that what we see and what we're sensing and what we're experiencing and what we're unraveling here is real. But then in that, there is a power that we have to face it and to not deny it and not shun it nor hide it. And then that's where we reclaim our light as well. And we can be a light looking at the dark.
When there's no explanation for the chaos that's happening in the world, it just feels random. That's what it feels like. It feels chaotic. It feels there's no explanation. There's no structure as to why the darkness exists and is happening. But when we understand there's a history to it, there's a lineage to it, like I see this as like the underground tentacles that are coming up into society. It's subtle, right? It's not overt.
Yeah.
And the more that we hone our ability to see it, it loses its power, right?